He used to tell me that my laugh was a condition, that there was something wrong with me. There isn't. That's the real me. I haven't been happy 1 minute of my entire life. You know what's funny? You know what really makes me laugh? I used to think that my life was a tragedy. But now I realize it's a f***ing comedy.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There is nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
Why do I say this? Because we got Holy Ghost power!
You're listening to a podcast exploring faith and fear, what scares us and what saves us. This is The Fear of God.
Hello and welcome back to the Fear of God podcast. It is a new year, an actual new year, a new year for the Fear of God. We've got a new website. We've got a new series happening, starting, overarching. We'll get to that. And there is just so much new, you guys, that it'll make people say, where did they get those wonderful toys? Speaking to you right now is one of your hosts, Nathan Rouse. And you know what, guys? Typically with me is fellow co-host Reed Lackey. But he was here a minute ago and he said he had to go dance with the devil in the pale moonlight. I guess we'll find out what that's all about soon enough. Ladies and gentlemen, here at the Fear of God, we explore the holy and the horrific at the intersection of faith and fear, dissecting what scares us in order to find what saves us. If that sounds something like you'd enjoy, come join us in the Facebook group for lively discussions around horror and genre-themed media, books, and film. It is a veritable coven of the faithfully frightful, and we would love to have your voice amongst the chorus, so consider yourself invited. Here at the Fear of God, we explore, we don't explain, except right now, when I'm going to explain that you can listen to the Fear of God podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, CastBox, other things I've never heard of, soon to be maybe Pandora. As they say in the Episcopal Church, are there others? If you know of other podcast platforms that you use that we're not on, let us know over at the website, thefearofgodpodcast.com. While you're at it, subscribe to us on your favorite platform, and also go ahead and leave us a 5-star rating and /or a glowing review. Speaking of the fearofgodpodcast.com, that brand new glorious website, head over there right now and learn all you ever wanted to know about this little podcast, including information about our brand new umbrella series for the year called 2020-2020. That's right. This past Friday, we released a recap episode that will tell you everything you need to know about what to expect from 2020-2020. Check that out on the website, read about it, yes, but also go to the polls to vote for what the best 20 horror movies of the last 20 years are, starting right now on this, our very own Super Tuesday. Also on the website, you will see plenty of lovely art provided exclusively for this podcast by the one and only inimitable illustrator Jacob Hunt. Do yourself a favor. Go click on the merch button on the website and make yourself a merch perch. You will find Fear of God art on t-shirts, mugs, cell phone cases, pillows. We also have Fear of God art on the one and only clown prince of Lackey, that Gary to my Randall. Reed, you're back, buddy. Hey, man, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Let me tell you, Nathan, you are my number one. Hi, guy.
Oh, my goodness. It is going to be one of those. We are back.
We
back.
back.
Have not been able to talk to people or each other that much.
It's
so it's
true.
going to be quite raucous.
Wait till they get a load of
And
us.
Reed, guess what? Speaking of number one guys,
Yeah.
before we get ahead of ourselves, I don't know if when you came back from your little dance with the devil, you passed somebody on your way in from the lobby. I don't know if you saw him out there.
I did.
But I would like to introduce you, Reed, and thus our listeners, to a man who has quite the reputation around these parts, if you know what I mean. Jacob Hunt! Jacob, you are here, finally, in the flesh, as it were. Welcome.
I'm here. I can hardly believe it.
I know.
He's been using Brand X.
Love that, Jacob. Oh, that is great. I think we may be talking about the wrong movie.
Yeah, possibly. We'll see.
Jacob, it is a long overdue appearance, and I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. So, Reed, I don't even know if you know this, but
I probably don't.
Jacob, you know a lot. There's I was trying to think of some funky phrase for the eras of my life that's like pre-read and post-read. I couldn't do it at the moment because I didn't plan on that. But Jacob and I have known each other for 25 years.
Oh, wow. Whoa, longer than you and I have known each other.
Maybe more. I think it's more. Like 93, 94.
I don't know how early we met, but I definitely met you when I was in middle school, I'd say.
Right. And that was a couple years ago. I'm kidding.
Decades.
No, I specifically, right. Well, my definitive, most pungent memory, if you will, is at Sun Week.
Do I want
which
to hear
I'm
this?
pretty sure was summer of 94 or
St.
5.
Simon's Island?
Yeah, bro.
Yeah.
I remember you and that other kid who I think's name was Jeff. And you would take...
Jeff does a podcast.
Really? I don't even remember Jeff's last name, but you stand out, so here you are. But y'all would take the mattresses off of the bunks in the cabin, and I distinctly remember the two of you on one of the mattresses on the floor singing A Whole New World from Aladdin.
Yeah.
Just being idiots.
Oh my gosh.
I remember that.
Well,
So,
Jeff was riding... He was riding the mattress as though it were a magic carpet.
A magic carpet. Wow. Man, I never thought I would feel like the third wheel on the show. Never imagined it would happen. But here we are. It's a whole new world, everybody. It's a whole new podcast indeed.
Don't you dare close your eyes, Reed.
No.
Don't do it.
It gets
So Jacob, yes, indeed. You can tell that Reed and I have not done this in a little while because we are trying to get every single word out that we possibly can. Jacob, so one, yes, definitively welcome to the show. It is long overdue. Your presence has been felt. You are the face of the show in a certain way if we are the voice of it. And so we're grateful you're here. We're grateful for your contributions to this little thing that we do here. Are you open? Are you comfortable just giving a little, 3 or 4 hour bio? Just kidding.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about what you're up to. Fill us in on who, as my 3-year-old, in quoting Tangled, will say, "Who are you and how did you find me?" So yes, Jacob.
How did I find you?
Who are you? No, I'm just quoting the movie Tangled. Don't think too hard about it. So yeah, what's going on in the world of Jacob? What are you working on? What would you like to say to the people?
Well, I am mostly, as far as putting food on the table and paying my rent, I'm a graphic designer and kind of a jack of all trades in that area, but I also do a lot of illustration. I went to SCAD for their sequential art program, so I have some intentions of doing comics if I can ever find the time to, pull something together. But also play music, and that drains a lot of time as well. I've been trying to release my band's album for a few years now, and the thing that's actually holding me up is finishing the artwork. So
what do you know?
Yeah.
Now, what have you what is something you've worked on recently other than Fear of God art that you'd look at and be like, I'm really proud of that? I know you had cited some book with the horse on the cover of some type that you just plugged in recently.
A buddy of mine.
You don't have to plug that one if that's not the one you want to plug, but it came to mind. And the mice, you can talk about the mice if you want to.
Well, that's probably the most fun thing for anybody that's looking to purchase something. But I've done a few books for a friend of mine, Derek Kamal, who has he's written 2 novels now and a couple of tabletop role-playing games. So I did artwork for one that he designed and wrote called The Dig. That's got like dwarves and stuff. And I did a few illustrations for that, did the cover artwork. And then that was a few years ago. And then I guess maybe 2 years ago now, we did the heavy metal Thunder Mouse. And he did a Kickstarter for that, and I ended up doing. And
is Thunder Mouse a graphic novel or a series?
That's also a tabletop role playing game.
Oh, okay.
So I did a lot of illustrations for that, and turned out pretty nice. You can get all that on Amazon. If you're into tabletop RPGs, check it out. We won an award too.
Cool.
At the Ennies.
It's a major award.
Must be Italian.
That's the Ennies. E-N.
Okay.
Stands for
not like the
not
like the belly
the
button.
Emmys, but
right, or the Ennies like a belly button.
Wow. Right. I can't remember what it stands for.
But
we won best. I think we were silver runner-up. Something in the family games.
Very cool.
Something.
Let's see, Jacob. We ask this of every guest, and it's not the question you're expecting. I forgot to prep you for it. So I'll ask it, and if you need me to come back to you, I will then pivot to read. So, what is something? It can be existential. It can be literal. This is a show about horror and the things that scare us. What is something that scares Jacob Hunt?
I guess the biggest thing that scares me is not finishing all the things I want to get done. Mentioned that album.
Yeah.
I've got a graphic novel concept that I developed heavily in grad school, and I graduated from that 7 years ago almost, and I haven't pitched it. So not getting any younger. So yeah, it's true. Existential.
That is a very existential one. Now, just out of curiosity, so that we can prepare ourselves, do you plan to finish this conversation?
That was quite the ellipsis. I'm in comic book parlance.
Jacob,
that's the scene where the panel is just close up of his face as he's like,
yes.
Am I gonna finish this conversation? I don't know.
Jacob is in good company. Reed, do you have any questions for Jacob before we move on?
I just always like to, I kind of along the same fear lines, I always like to ask new guests kind of what your affection for, or lack thereof, depending. I mean, the answer can be anything. What's your kind of intersection with the horror genre? Do you have some favorite, scary type of stuff? Are you somebody who doesn't really get into that genre that much, and is only sort of the major things that you'll still see? Kind of what are some of your favorites if you have them? So talk a little bit about that.
I'd say, just painting the broad picture of, I guess, how horror movies have played into my life. I guess I was one of those kids that was pretty much forbidden from watching them. So I was always fascinated and eager to watch them, and caught a few edited down for Fox afternoon movies and stuff. But I mean, I'm not like a total obsessive or anything, but
Sure.
I'd say, a horror movie's an always fun go-to. My wife is a pretty big fan of thrillers, so that's always something. If there's a good horror movie or a thriller, that's an easy movie night for us.
Nice.
But I guess I don't know if I'd call it my favorite, but maybe The Ring made a huge impression on me, just because, I mean, a jump scare is one thing, the discomfort of seeing like someone like, stabbed and gore, those are all things that you'll find in the horror genre that you get your thrills out of. But just the psychological dread of The Ring, and it's only PG-13, yet it was more haunting than like anything I'd ever seen.
Sure.
I actually watched that with mine and Nathan's mutual friend, Brendan. We watched that in the movie theater together, and I just remember at a certain point noticing I'm actually on the edge of my seat.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And then I look over at Brendan. He's also on the edge of his seat. Yeah, that was just
cool.
A horror movie that looms large for me.
Sure. We had done an episode on The Ring and had mentioned that, I mean, it's a pretty pivotal movie for the early 2000s, which we'll talk about why that matters in just a little bit. But yeah, it's one of those films that sort of kicked a door down for a new wave in the horror genre, where suddenly there were a lot of films that basically the trend of American filmmakers and American producers remaking films that had been substantive hits in like the Asian markets, and so that launched a big wave of that. But The Ring still kind of looms near the top, if not at the top, of that whole subset of genre. So yeah, that totally makes sense. I understand. Well, Nathan,
Yep.
do you mind?
Read.
Do you mind if we get into something that I'm kind of excited?
I'm excited.
so excited.
Are you excited?
I'm so
too?
excited.
Let's do
Okay,
it.
so here's what we're gonna do. And Jacob, we're gonna invite you along for this little ride, but we've got a big movie to talk about, so we want to try to we'll try to keep steady pace with this, but we have had you listeners been voting for the past month on your favorite horror films of 2019. And we are starting in this next few weeks covering some entries from this top 10, but right now, you have to wait no further. Right now, this moment, we are going to begin counting down your top 10 favorite horror films of 2019. This is always so exciting for me. I'm so excited.
Hey, Reed.
Yes.
I got a quick question before we get started.
Sure.
Have you watched all of these?
I am still missing one. And so, listeners, before we get too far down this path, if you'll recall last year, Nathan tried very hard, made something of a bit too much of a deal to
succeeded.
He
tried and succeeded.
Not your turn, Nathan. So he worked very hard to watch all of the 2018 best of horror films before I did, and yes, so now that has become something of a race to the finish. I have no idea how many theater dollars he spent. Well, he's on A-list, so maybe not many, but he went to see.
Love that A-list.
Yeah, he went to see.
Love that Joker.
so many of these in the theater, and yes, in fact, what upset me is before you completed the list, I had seen 9 of them. So
I knew the one
Yes.
that was outstanding for you. I was like, "There's no way he's gonna get
there's
to
no
it."
way I could get to it. And what was really frustrating is I actually tried. So the story about that one is I actually tried to see it in the theaters, but it left theaters so dang
That's
fast
hysterical.
that my wife and I couldn't get out to see it. So yes, because of that, I am missing one of these, and you have seen.
That's
them
all it takes.
all.
That's all it takes
So,
is one.
yes.
So what's really great about the fact that Jacob is here is Jacob last year when I made much ado about the fact that I had beaten Reed to the punch on the top 10, because if you know much about the history of this show, Reed brought me into this genre, and your art, which is the image of Dr. Riedenstein giving life to Franken-Nathan, is just, it just keeps imitating life, imitating art, imitating life. Like, I am alive, and I am wreaking havoc and calling friend, and just loving the fact that I win. I win like Heisenberg,
And
I win.
Dr. Riedenstein is disgusted with what he has created.
I am.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, he keeps trying to get me to make him a bride, and it's really complicated, and I don't want to do this. So, yes.
All right. So, yes, the best horror of 2019 that was voted on by our listeners during our off month in January, wherein during that off month we had more downloads than we had the previous month because we weren't
which is bizarre.
Totally off. It's wild. So how do you want to do this? Do you want to go?
I was going to ask you the same thing. So why don't we do this? So, Jacob, I'm presuming you don't have the list in front of you. So Nathan,
you presume wrong.
Oh, nice.
Whoa.
Okay, so then here's what we'll do. It doesn't break down completely evenly, but why don't we go in a rotation of me, then Nathan, then Jacob, starting at 10, and then wherever it lands, it lands. One of us will have one fewer than the rest, but why don't we, or one of us will have one more, but I'll start with number 10, and then we'll go to Nathan,
ironic.
and then to... So counting down your list, so here's the thing, and here's the biggest reason why I wanted to start with number 10 is because number 10 on this list, I don't have directors written in front of me, so if I don't know them in my mind immediately, then my apologies, listeners. But number 10 on your list was the anti-Superman film, or the alt-world Superman film, Brightburn. That was your number 10. It narrowly...
That's a pretty good movie.
Well, so it narrowly beat out... a film that I adore, and I'm in the minority. I recognize that I'm in the minority. It narrowly beat out M. Night Shyamalan's Glass, and that's a conversation for another time. But I didn't like Brightburn, at all. I actively disliked it, and so anyway, yes. So thank you, listeners, for humiliating me in this moment.
It's still inexplicable, but I just have to, I've been known like a Russian to tip an election, to tip a vote. And when it came time to record for The Stand, one of our quarterly kings, I had my wife vote for the one I wanted. But I did not do that on this. It should be noted. But listeners won't know that there has been an ongoing conversation for the last 6 months, or however long it's been, about Brightburn. And I didn't know Reed hated it. And then I watched it. And I was like, oh, that's a decent little flick. And then I happened to just randomly mention it. And he's like, oh, it's garbage. So
I don't think I was that vitriolic, but I do not like it.
It was like that. You're like, Brightburn. So it was just thrilling knowing his love of Glass, which it's fine. I'm not actually poo-pooing Glass, but it was just funny to see they were neck and neck for forever in this
they really were.
Race.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden Brightburn kicked up a notch, like, oh wow, that's classic. So next on the list,
classic.
Jacob, did you see Brightburn?
I didn't.
It's decent. If
you shouldn't watch it.
Just flip a coin and that'll tell you. Number 9, coming in at number 9 is the film Godzilla King of the Monsters, and this was my last one I had to get to. I did get to it the other night, and of course I watched it with a smile on my face the whole time, knowing it meant that when the credits rolled, I was winning.
Oh my gosh.
Not because the movie's actually that good, really.
It's fun. It's fun. I mean, it's little more than fun, but it's fun.
It's visually, it's fantastic.
I will say that it's got some impressive visuals.
Yeah, it's really dumb. It's like great actors that I really think a lot of just saying stupid crap. Jacob, chime in have you seen Godzilla? I'm going to do these on all of these.
Have not seen Godzilla.
Okay.
All right.
You can, that one's an easy pass. Jacob, what is number 8?
We got Parasite.
Ooh,
yeah. Parasite. Stay tuned, everybody. That's next week's episode. But yes, so
one on which we can all agree.
Oh, it's great. It's great. I'm actually, I think, honestly, the only comment that I'll make about this, and sincerely we can, stay tuned, listeners, for next week, but the only thing about this is that given its placement here, I wonder if people were in some debate about whether or not it is considered a traditional horror film, which we can get to that later time, but I'm honestly surprised to see it so low in the list, and that's kind of the only thing that I can think of is, maybe people don't consider it really a standard traditional horror film, and so that's why it's at number 8 versus a little higher, because it's excellent.
But some of these, like another one up the list too, which actually surprises me how far up the list it is, but some of these I also wonder about, how widespread the release was. And
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
'Cause
Yeah. No, that's a fair
I'm
point.
with you, having rewatched in prep for talking about it. It should be much higher on this list. Reed, what's number 7?
Okay, so number 7 on the list is somewhat also divisive in the Fear of God community, and that is It Chapter 2, a film that I admittedly it has some flaws to it, but I really responded to rather positively, and again, am somewhat in the minority on that. But you voted it for It Chapter 2 as your number 7 favorite horror film of 2019.
Number 6 on this top 10 of 19 is the sequel, Happy Death Day to You.
This delighted me.
Yeah, I mean, I actually like the film. It did surprise me it placed as highly as it did, not because I think it's bad whatsoever, just I think it's good. I don't know that I would put it this high up the list. Jacob, have you seen either of those?
I saw It Too, did not see Happy Death Day.
Did you see the original one? Did you see the first one?
No.
They're both decent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would strongly recommend the first one, and depending on how you respond to the first one, would cover whether or not I would recommend the second one. Because I think if you enjoyed the first one, the second one's an easy recommendation. They're both quite strong, but if you don't respond very positively to the first one, then there's no need to give an attempt to the second one.
I think a comic book writer came up with the concept for this.
That sounds right.
I feel like it was one of the big 90s guys that worked on X-Men
Rob
or something.
Liefeld?
No.
What's next, Jacob? What's next? Number 6?
Ready or Not.
That's number 5.
This is number 5.
Actually.
Yeah,
yes.
This is number 5. And
Very
that's Ready or
good
Not.
film.
Yeah.
That's an excellent
I dug
movies.
that one.
Oh, so you did see that one. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's very, very good. We're going to be covering that later this month, but yeah, it's a really, really good movie. Okay, so number 4 is The Reason Nathan won, everybody. It's The Reason, because I tried to go see this in the theater. My wife and I had plans. Our babysitter had to change the schedule, so we couldn't go see it the night we intended to, and then by the time the next opportunity came open, it had already left theaters. But it is Mike Flanagan's Dr. Sleep, the sequel to The Shining, and so I'm anxiously awaiting the opportunity for me to now acquire it and see it finally. But yeah, that's the reason Nathan won, is because I didn't get to see Dr. Sleep. Otherwise, I would have won this year. But anyhow,
I'm just a bigger horror fan, Reed. That's the reason.
You know what?
Just next on the list at number 3, a surprising placement for this film, not because it doesn't deserve it. It definitely does, but because I was just surprised that many people had seen it, and that is Ari Aster's Midsommar, starring Florence Pugh, whom you may have seen most recently in the fantastic Greta Gerwig written and directed Little Women. This is very much not Little Women. Midsommar is wild, and
it is.
Yeah. Did you see either of his films, Jacob? Hereditary or this?
Yeah, I've seen both. And I saw the extended Midsommar.
Oh, I've got it. I haven't watched it yet.
Nice.
I'm planning to watch that. Is that the only version you've seen?
Yeah, it's the only version I've seen.
Very cool.
Oh man, yeah, I've also got it. I can't wait to watch it.
What's next, Jacob?
Joker.
Ta-da! We're gonna be talking about that a lot today. Number 2.
And I haven't seen this one.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool.
This is going to be a strange conversation.
It is. It's going to be much shorter than expected.
All right, so
bring us home, Reed.
Y'all ready for number 1? I will say before we announce it that once a few votes started pouring in, as usually happens, there will be a few early front runners, and then some places will change along the list. Like Happy Death Day to You, I think in the early votes was in the top 3. Then things just begin to, as more people vote, things just begin to sort of shift around and take place. But from the first few votes, there was an unqualified number 1. It got more votes than anything else, and was easily outpacing everything else throughout the entire voting process. And that is your number 1 favorite horror film of 2019 is Jordan Peele's Us. Which I certainly I understand why it's there. Honestly, don't really disagree. I think just in terms of pure inventiveness and packs a decent punch. We also covered that one earlier last year, just in the course of formatting. Jacob, did you see Us?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I think it's such a great movie. Honestly, I responded to it. Just Jordan Peele's given us 2 great films now, but I responded to Us a bit more strongly than I did Get Out. I think they're both wonderful films, but Us really just galvanized my imagination. I thought it was really powerful. All right, so that is it. That is your listener-voted top 10 horror films of 2019. So before we move into our main conversation, I want to also take this moment to encourage you. Nathan mentioned at the top of the show, we are doing a series called 2020, and it requires listener participation. If you were to go right now to thefearofgodpodcast.com and you were to click on, follow the little trails for the 2020 banner, you will be led to the opportunity to vote on your favorite horror films of the year 2000. There's a few years available, but the main one that we want to focus on right now is the year 2000. You'll see 30 nominees. You will pick your favorites from those 30 nominees, and we will tally up the list. We will be covering something later in, probably within the next month, covering something from that top 10 list. Maybe the number one. If we've already covered the number one, maybe something else. So go in there, cast your vote, get out the vote for the best horror films of the year 2000. That's available at thefearofgodpodcast.com. So we've now reached the point, having our extensive bit of business out of the way, where we need to talk about today's film. And my goodness, there is so much to talk about. So we are covering today by director Todd Phillips of the Hangover trilogy fame. That still boggles my mind. We are covering the 2019 controversial smash hit, Joker. That was what
bona fide hit. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Major moneymaker.
Did it hit $1 billion? I think it hit $1 billion.
I think
I'm
so.
pretty
yeah.
sure it did. Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure it did.
Insane.
So what we're going to do, this is a big conversation, and I'll be a little upfront with the fact that not only is it a big conversation, but some of the topics, may require some room to discuss. So I want to get through some kind of more cursory highlights about the film, and we're going to adopt the recent format that we've done, where I've got a few questions to sort of prompt discussion for us along the way. But the main thing is we're going to try to sort of make our way through some general feelings about the film and then maybe get into some of the meatier areas. But Jacob, being new to the show, please feel free if something sparks your imagination and you want to sort of discuss it, then feel free to just go ahead and go where the conversation takes you. But if you guys are ready, we'll sort of dive into some specifics, if that's okay.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, so my first question up top is just each of us give a general statement about the film. Just how do you feel about the film, as briefly as possible in broad strokes. So Nathan, I'll start with you. Maybe talk about your reactions on the initial watch and maybe the rewatch or whatever. Just how do you feel about this film in general?
So, yeah, I was, I will attempt to be brief. That will be challenging. But I was that guy who went in dubious. I remember watching the trailer and thinking, gosh, I just don't know if that's helpful. And then, there was so much controversy around its release and the possible reactions to it. And so I wanted to be, as I do, I wanted to be part of the conversation. So I knew I would see it, and I went in ready to be critical. And ready to be kind of on guard about it. And honestly, the first viewing, maybe within 10 minutes, I had the active thought, I don't know that this is helpful, and I don't know that it maybe, quote unquote, should have been made or is made at the right moment. But that notwithstanding, this is pretty dang interesting. And it's really well made. So that was the first viewing. I've really, by the end of the film, by the end of that screening, I was kind of blown away and bowled over by what I'd experienced.
Sure.
And then skipping ahead, rewatching for this conversation, I still have aspects of the film that I think are extremely praiseworthy. But on the second viewing, some of the things that I was more able to ignore with some ease the first time stood out more heavily on this second viewing. So it was a little more measured second viewing. Again, still I think a lot there worth praising as a film, but struggled a little bit on this one than I did the first time. So yeah.
Understandable. Jacob, how about you? What are your general feelings on the film?
I'd echo a lot of what Nathan said. His way he felt going into it. Some skepticism initially baked in, I guess, but then thought it was a very powerful film as I was watching it. Wasn't sure I was actually enjoying it necessarily, but I nonetheless thought it was very resonant. It's obviously gorgeously shot, very well acted, but yeah, just such a painful topic, and clearly from critical reactions from my friends, just the takeaways from it don't land the same with everyone.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
And second viewing, I would say actually enjoyed it more on the second viewing. So I'll be interested at what bits you pick apart somewhat. But
sure.
I was feeling defensive for the film already. So as I watched it the second time, and just some of the reactions that I'd heard of it, kind of, I was a little irritated by some of them. So already kind of thinking, how are people, not getting it?
Right.
Hey,
Understood.
Not getting it. That's kind of a big line in the movie.
That's true, because you wouldn't get it. So mine are a bit more. I'm probably about to split the difference between the two. So I went in with. I wouldn't say skepticism. I was incredibly curious, and I would even say I went in with a good deal of goodwill, where I was like, no, I'm curious to see what this is. And I was blown away. My first viewing, I was just so galvanized by it, just couldn't stop thinking about it. And my wife and I discussed it for probably a few hours after we had seen it. And so I was really enthralled by it, loved it. It echoed in my imaginations and in several conversations I had following it. For this second viewing, I think there are some elements that I appreciated and loved even more, while others, to my surprise, began to ding me a little bit as like, I don't know if that part holds up, or I don't know if I respond as strongly to that when it's no longer a surprise. And we'll get into some more of those specifics. But so this one was a bit of a strange viewing for me, because there are things I think I walked out of the second viewing loving and appreciating even more, while there are others that I'm like, that didn't work for me as much this time around. So it's a fascinating film all the way around. I think that's pretty safe to say. Can
I throw in one little thought here?
Sure.
My little summary after I watched it the first time that I still think holds, because my skepticism was about just, do we really need not just the controversial aspects, but from a comic book controversy aspect, do we really need the Joker origin story, as it were? And I remember walking out of the theater thinking, like, my conscious thought was, if you're going to do a Joker origin, which I don't know is a great idea, but whatever, if you're going to do it, that's how you do it. And I just remember having that kind of thought. So anyway, carry on, please.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think it's safe to say right now that that Joker, after Jack Nicholson, which we quoted immensely from the Tim Burton Batman at the top of the episode, and Heath Ledger's massively impressive and Oscar. Now, forgive me for forgetting, Oscar nominated or Oscar winning? Did he win posthumously?
Winning. Yeah. Yes.
Posthumous Oscar win for his portrayal of Joker. I think it's safe to say now that Joker is one of, in terms of American cinema, one of the quintessential American cinematic roles. So what I want to know, and Jacob, I'm coming to you first, how does Joaquin Phoenix's performance stack up amongst his peers? And specifically, I'm thinking all the way back to Cesar Romero from the TV show Batman. I'm thinking of Jack Nicholson in Tim Burton's Batman. I'm thinking of Mark Hamill for his now legendary work on Batman the Animated Series, Heath Ledger in Dark Knight, and who can forget Jared Leto from Suicide Squad. So
Jared Leto doesn't forget, that's for sure.
Literally forgot that as you were making your list.
So
And I'm glad you reminded me, because that is my favorite.
I'm gonna mute you now.
That's really hard for me to call, because each of them are so different and I think important in different ways.
Yeah.
But I mean, definitely no, I don't even want to say definitely, because so top 4, I would say, Mark Hamill and Jack Nicholson, Heath Ledger and Joaquin Phoenix are
sure.
But I don't think I can choose, but maybe just because this one's so fresh and just so absolutely Joker centric.
Yeah,
it kind of feels like as amazing as Heath Ledger's performance is, he's still supporting Batman in that, But.
Yeah, of course. And it's important to note, even with my question, that they're after different things, that each of the performances are different in tone. Nathan, where does Joaquin stack in the list among his peers of Joker characterizations?
I don't. I think it's possible, and I could be wrong here. I think it's possible the desire or the intention was that it's kind of clear cut, but it's funny because I've thought about this. I had a coworker, I don't know, around about the time this film was releasing, and someone was like, "Oh, I've heard it's better than Heath Ledger," and these are not really cinephile type people. And I was like, well, I don't know that that's actually, it's kind of apples and oranges.
Yeah.
Joaquin Phoenix, if you could place money right now. So we're recording almost about 10 days before the Oscars. Phoenix has won every acting award of the major prizes so far.
Yes.
And is pretty much guaranteed to win the Oscar for Best Actor.
Very likely.
And that doesn't mean that everything that wins an Oscar throughout history earned that Oscar, but Joaquin is most assuredly earning his through this performance. It's otherworldly. It is transcendent. I think it can't be overlooked that Joaquin has inherited the Daniel Day-Lewis mantle in terms of just actors that are so transcendent and transformative in their performances. That said, a conversation that I'll layer in here and we can touch on again at some point is I think why it's hard to me is the more I've pondered this, the more I don't know if you were to say who's the best Joker, I would probably pick Heath Ledger. If you were to say who is the best performer in the role where they're called Joker that's Batman mythos adjacent, I would say Joaquin. Because I know that's weird splitting hairs, but I think Phillips, and we'll get to this, I'm actually not a fan of Phillips. I think he did the smart choice as a filmmaker in this era, which is Trojan Horse, a story under the guise of a comic book film that really isn't, right? Right. And so from that standpoint, this is a immensely fascinating story about an incredibly down on his luck member of society at the very bottom of it and the plagues he endures. Now, they happen to throw clown makeup on him and call it Joker. So it's hard to answer that. Right. So for me, this is I don't know if you're just like mad at me for this type of answer right now, but it's like
no. As
Joker, Ledger.
Sure.
As performance, Joaquin is insanely otherworldly. What he does in this film is bonkers.
Yeah. No, I can accept that. So for me, it's interesting charting through these people, like going all the way back to, like, again, Cesar Romero in the 1960s Batman TV show was wildly over the top and was just super animated and silly. And then you see a lot of that sort of pop sensibility in Nicholson's performance. You also see that translate in Mark Hamill's voice work. What was interesting about when Ledger took on the role is the character they had kind of emphasized the clown portion of it, so everything's really silly and even in the more macabre and homicidal tendencies, he's still got this sort of there is a buffoonish clownishness to him, a very exaggerated is probably the word that I'm looking for, sort of sense to it. But then when Heath Ledger took the role, part of what made that role so brilliant is how sinister he made him while still embodying those same traits. But he was so frightening. Like, Ledger was just immensely frightening as Joker. And I feel like, and boy, there is so much you could say. Perhaps it's going to feel like bullying at this point, but I think they pivoted too hard for that in Jared Leto's Joker, because then it's just all sinister, and it's so graphically, it's back to like this extreme version on the outskirts of reality. One of the things that I find so impressive about Joaquin Phoenix's performance, naturally it's an origin story, so this would be to a degree required, but Joaquin Phoenix finally, after all these performances, made Joker human. And we can talk about how that, whether or not that is a right approach, whether or not that is a valuable approach. We can get into all of that if we need to. But it is so fascinating to me how fragile and vulnerable Joaquin Phoenix is at certain times, and the ways in which even the affectations of Joker become simultaneously menacing and sympathetic, which is crazy to me.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there's so much going on in Joaquin Phoenix's performance. It's really hard to ignore it in the sort of the pantheon of this character, and it will be fascinating if he does win the Oscar, because it is rare. It's not it's not unique, but it is rare for two different actors to win an Oscar for the same character, for playing the same character. And so that's going to be really fascinating once the Oscars sort of reveal themselves. Pivoting out of that to another question, a little bit more superficial still, but besides Joaquin Phoenix, name another performance that you either like, or you can name one that you don't particularly care for.
Well, I'm going to cheat since I went first and name one of the only real substantial roles in it. And I suppose Zazie Beetz, whom I just really think highly of. I love the show Atlanta. She has a fun role in the Deadpool 2 film. I think she's beautiful. I think she's a heck of an actor. She just shines when she's on screen. Again, like I said, I think I'm stealing a little bit because there's not a ton of other screen time given to folks, but I will, because I come in ready to enjoy her on screen, I will pick her. And I also think she's good in the film, so.
Awesome. Jacob, what about for you?
Yeah, it's hard to think of anybody other than her character who really has enough going on. You know?
Sure.
I can't think of anybody that really brought the movie down, so to speak.
Right.
But yeah, right. She Zazie Beetz was great in that. Yeah, she just glows basically.
Yeah,
That's a good word for it.
Yeah, she's really wonderful. Okay, so you guys are kind of making a point that I was going to bring up later, but I'll go ahead and bring it. I think one of the things that you could ding the film for is, for better or worse, Joaquin Phoenix towers so immensely performance-wise over this. I mean, you've got Robert De Niro in, a sizable role.
That's funny. I totally forgot about him in my response.
Right. You've got Frances Conroy, who is a long established veteran actor, and playing Penny Fleck, Arthur's mother, and then Brett Cullen, Shea Wiggum, like all of these people are really strong character performers. But
actually, I love Bill Camp too. By the way,
Bill Camp, absolutely. And so that's one of the things.
Who was that?
He's the other detective.
Yeah, Shea Wiggum or Wiggum and Bill Camp were the detectives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Bill Camp, Nathan, I don't know if you're watching it or not, but it plays a prominent role in The Outsider, the HBO Outsider series.
I am, in fact, watching The Outsider, yes.
Nice. But one of the things that I think is that because Joaquin Phoenix looms so large over this performance, over this production, it is difficult. I think he kind of, and this is not necessarily a better or worse statement about it, but I think he kind of overshadows everybody. I mean, we can pinpoint Zazie Beetz because she is so, like you said, she's radiant in the scenes that she have, and Arthur as a character pays deliberate attention to her.
Sure.
And so that elevates it a little bit. But it is fascinating that like Joaquin Phoenix is so saturated in this story that you almost don't have a movie without him. You like not only just the character, but with somebody else doing lesser work than Joaquin's doing. I don't know if the film holds together, pivoting to a little bit of my later thoughts. But I will answer the question this way, and just, again, mentioning Robert De Niro, who I go back and forth on whether or not I like him in this, which we can maybe spend a second talking about here, that I feel like his character is very poorly defined. I don't mean his performance. I mean Murray is just, he feels like this very caricature of this kind of, early 80s late night TV show host that doesn't seem to have a lot of real substance.
Have you seen King of Comedy?
I have not. Now, I have heard that it was a tremendous influence. It's one of the few Scorsese films I haven't seen, but no, I've never seen King of Comedy.
To Jacob's point, that was what I was going to say in response to you, is that one of the major criticisms of the film Joker is just how much it apes King of Comedy in a very direct way, to the point of putting De Niro in the role. I mean, in the film.
Yeah.
Have you seen it then?
Yeah.
Okay.
And for listeners who haven't, King of Comedy is a 70s. Is it Scorsese or?
It is Scorsese.
Yeah.
About
it's 80s.
Is it 80s?
Is it?
Okay. About a gentleman who, I don't know that. Does the film establish mental illness, Jacob, or is it just kind of quirky?
I mean, it's
in its
pretty,
way.
It's got to be.
But he
basically.
So in this film, the best way to analog this, in this film, when Arthur has those imaginings, those daydreams about his own performance career and performance life, that is literally the King of Comedy. It's this kind of mentally challenged character envisioning themselves as this wildly successful and or at least thriving performer.
Interesting. Yeah. Fascinating. So pivoting out of that, I have just a couple more surface questions, and then we'll dive into perhaps some heavier stuff. But how did you guys feel? I'm going to start with my feelings on it this time around and then go around from there. But how did you guys feel about the integration of the larger Batman elements to it, specifically the presence of, Thomas Wayne and Bruce Wayne? And I'm looking for, in an answer, like, do you feel like it was kind of just right? Was it a little bit too much? Was it not quite enough to establish it for what they were after? For my feelings on it, this was the specific element that dinged down for me. Watching it the first time in the theater, I found these inclusions to be really cool and kind of fun, and I liked it a lot. Anytime something that was connected to the larger Batman mythos came up, I was really interested and excited. The second time watching it, those were the moments that I zoned out. Like the moment they start digging into, is Thomas Wayne my father, and him going to Wayne Manor and everything, I sort of started to lose interest in what I was seeing, which I found really interesting just in a viewing experience. I'm like, wow, I'm starting to zone out now that they're getting into all the Batman stuff. When it's just Joker being, or when it's just Arthur being Arthur, I'm still arrested. I love it even more. But when they pivot into all this larger Batman connections, it didn't hold up as well for me the second time around. So, Jacob, what do you think about that in general? Like, did you like all of that? Do you feel like they could have done more? Was it just what it needed to be? What'd you think?
So, on initial viewing, the Thomas Wayne connection and I guess we go full on spoiler.
Yes.
Oh, yes. As we talk, right?
Yeah.
So it didn't sit right with me.
Okay.
The possible half brother of Joker and Batman. It wasn't the Batman universe that I kind of have in my head.
Sure.
And like that's kind of a big way I go into viewing these comic book movies, which I guess maybe it would have been good to establish that I'm like a total comic book nerd, at least growing up. So, this era of comic book movies I'm pretty heavily invested in. more of a Marvel guy. So, I think any comic book reader, you get your own individual concept of who these characters are, how they all connect.
Right.
But that's not necessarily going to hold across all of fandom.
Right.
Right. I'm saying I'm more of a Marvel guy. I didn't read tons and tons of Batman. So, there's just certain like character attributes or plot elements that I'm going to be like, no, that's not Batman. That's not Joker. That's not their relationship. So I didn't like that, seeing that in the theater. And, there might be a Batman story out there that implies that. And, it might be in the source material somewhere. But for me, it's just seeing like, that's kind of stupid. I kind of hate coincidence type stuff like that. And it kind of smacks of like a chosen one narrative, like, fate, that kind of stuff. I like these universes to feel a little more like organic and real, and not rely too heavily on like that kind of soap opera thing. So that's kind of how it felt in the theater. But in the initial theater viewing experience, the thing that really I enjoyed how it ties into my concept of Joker is, I'd say the Joker that like I most know is really probably from the animated series.
Yeah.
Like that's, the movies are great, but they're like a little snapshot, and they're not really building a universe, which is what comics do and an animated series that runs that long can do. And so Joker, I guess in the cartoon, one thing that, and just a lot of these villains, you're like, why are these idiots following Joker? Like he has like an unlimited supply of henchmen just doing the dumbest things. And so the way this movie, which, you've already sat through this like depressingly realistic movie about a real human being, and then it's just, for me, dovetailed perfectly into like an actual realistic Joker origin story. And here he has like this cult-like grip on all these followers, and I'm like, okay, this cool. So this is like the perfect kind of achievement in a comic book movie for me, because I mean I love comics, but so many of them are so dumb. And so I love the degree to which Marvel movies can like kind of make it in the real world. I mean, still it's like sci-fi, big dumb fantasy absurdity, but to whatever extent it makes it like, oh, these are real people with real relationships and real things happening. I love that. And then when it can, tie into the mythology that I kind of have, hardwired into my brain, that's what I love. And so for it to like kind of explain why he has all these bozos under his thumb, I thought that was pretty sweet. But I'll say the second viewing, I kind of forgave the Batman Joker half-brother thing, because on that viewing, I felt like it was actually saying something very, very thematically important. So
interesting.
Even though I feel like it's kind of stupid and soap opera-y, I forgave it because, like I said, I felt like it did tie into the themes that were, really starting to pop out for me in the movie.
Sure, I understand. Nathan, how about for you?
Clarify for me. They dispense with that, right? Like they posit it as a idea, the familial connection, but they don't honor it, right? Like,
right. Well, I was actually gonna. I think the first when I saw it in the theater, I feel like I felt it was more leaning towards, yes, they are half brothers. I think my second viewing, I might have been a little distracted because I was writing like a outline of the plot as I watched it the second time. But I felt like it was
a good job.
Well, I had the broad strokes.
Sure.
I wanted to go back and watch, I guess, the scene where he's looking over the notes of his mother's stay in Arkham.
Right.
And just kind of, watch it closely and just like, okay, what do I think the director's intent here? What does he want me to assume? And does he want it to be completely ambiguous? And so I felt like second viewing, it was leaning more towards they weren't related, but I think it is supposed to be ambiguous, and I'm kind of forgetting. What was your question?
Yeah, no, you've addressed it. So I am not stating one way or the other, because clearly maybe I thought in my memory it sort of decides by the end of it that that's not the case. But by what you're saying, Jacob, and Reed, you seemed hesitant there. Is it ambiguous?
Yeah. I feel it's left ambiguous because there is a narrative thread through the film that either his mom is delusional and fantasized about Thomas Wayne and then adopted this child and invented this story, or Thomas Wayne had an affair with her, presumably a coercive affair with her, and then fabricated this whole adoption thing in order to make it give him an out, if you will. And so why I feel the film is kind of ambiguous about that is that in that scene where Arthur confronts Thomas Wayne, I feel like that moment it's left kind of unresolved, but leaning a little bit more heavily that Arthur believes he is Thomas Wayne's son. And so you can feel the doubt in what Joaquin Phoenix is doing in that moment, but he's making a very, sort of impassioned case that he is Thomas Wayne's son. And Thomas Wayne reacts very violently to that. And so
does that scene precede his visit to the records department?
It follows it, I believe. And now I'm struggling to remember, but I believe the scene...
Let me consult my
timeline. Consult your
master
timeline.
notes.
So I've written he went to the opera. The scene, he confronts Thomas Wayne before he goes to the records room.
Gotcha.
Because I'd say when he's seeing Thomas Wayne, he definitely thinks he's his son because he read that in his mom's letter.
Right.
And then afterwards, he goes to Arkham and he finds the record of his adoption.
Right.
And then he has this like flashback where he's like imagining watching his mom being interviewed, I guess, by a psychiatrist. And so I think that scene can be imagined to an extent. It's not like he's witnessing the actual past. But
isn't it that the scene where they describe her lover, I thought some version of, maybe not relative, but a caretaker at least briefly for Arthur, abusing him brutally.
Yes.
Which is, but y'all are still saying it's ambiguous whether Arthur is or isn't the...
Well, my interpretation of that scene where he's reading the records is that she was forced into accepting this narrative. So, in other words, I'm trying to describe it very clearly. I think the film, because it establishes Joaquin Phoenix as an unreliable narrator, anything that he visualizes is suspect. Anything. And so, as a result, I think it's difficult to conclude definitively that moment he's seeing with his mom being interviewed is purely like the psychiatrist trying to help her rather than the money machine of Thomas Wayne silencing a potential problem and fabricating the rest of this around so that she is silenced because they've now got documentation of his adoption. They've now got documentation that he was abused. And so because of that, she has no leg to stand on if she tries to stand up and say, hey, by the way, you know what you did. This is really your son. And so that's why I think there is an error of interpretation. I do think there's a case to be made for both sides. But one of the things I simultaneously love and am frustrated by in the film is the way in which it does not resolve certain key pivotal elements. It leaves them very subjective, which I have some comments about when we get a little bit later in.
Well, if I may, on the Batman of it all, at least briefly, for me, I don't know. we are listeners. Next week we are talking about Parasite, and I just rewatched that, and I'm not going to comment on it per se, except to talk about its stellarness. And I think what's hard for me about the film Joker is I love so much about the aesthetic, about the performance, about the kind of chaotic energy it has in its DNA. I love the setting. I love so much. I mean, the just the camera work. There's a lot to really love. Something I can't kind of shake is a highly laced level of cynicism that is, maybe that's interpretive, but even to the meta degree of the Batman of it all. In other words, I'm so interested in the character Arthur Fleck and don't even really mind much of what that character goes through in the film Joker, where the scaffolding and the seams are so visible is the Batman stuff, where it's like, come on, y'all, this is just not. And maybe it's a cynical product, maybe it's a cynical filmmaker, maybe it's a cynical industry, right? Like, all of these things might be true. Maybe none of them are true, but that Todd Phillips thinks, well, in order to get this film and this story I'm really interested in telling made, I have to kind of, package it in comic booky, and thus it gets infused with a heavy dose of Batman. And there's a heavy sort of school of criticism of the kind of DC Warner Brothers machine that they refuse to do anything other than Batman. They had they tried to make Superman Batman. Now they succeeded with Wonder Woman, and that's a pivot to a different kind of era. But just watching this film and the Thomas Wayne, I'm like, I just don't care. Like, I don't need, or kind of to your point, Jacob, like, I don't want, I want to take what the movie gives me, which sounds two-faced right now. No Batman villain pun intended. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, well, are we a Batman movie or are we an Arthur Fleck movie? And that's when the seams start to show. That's when the oil hits the water and it's not.
So do you feel like Batman was shoved into it just to make it more of a Batman movie?
Not to make it more of a Batman movie, to make it sell more tickets. That's the cynical approach I'm after here, because I think the Arthur Fleck story is really interesting. I think it's kind of like, you start the TV show Gotham. Well, it's not going to be Batman. It's going to be Gordon. Well, then it starts with Kid Bruce, and it's like, okay, well, this is a Batman show. They want to have their cake and eat it too, which on a certain level is fine, whatever. It just, at a certain point, I'm like, do I need to see Thomas and Martha Wayne killed again in an alley? No, I don't. One of the brilliant aspects, in a random aside here, one of the brilliant aspects of the Tom Holland Spider-Man is we don't need to see Uncle Ben's murder. Like, it's just been done. There are things that we can go 15 or 20 years now and be okay pop culturally not having to see again. And so for me, I'd hesitate to say the plot screeches to a halt, but it's less interesting when it is intersecting with the Batman mythos, as opposed to being an Arthur Fleck story, who is extremely fascinating as a character.
That is identical to my second viewing experience. I didn't feel that way the first time through, but the second time through, I was like, I'm just not interested in the way this connects to the larger Batman mythos. But it was surprising to me to have that experience the second time through, but literally everything surrounding the character of Arthur, everything surrounding his sort of attempts to come into his own and embrace his own identity and to make sense of the world, I found really interesting. And obviously it's frightening and haunting, which we'll get into in a second. But when it sort of connects to the larger Batman world, that's when and your word, Nathan, is appropriate. Like, I just lost interest at that point. This is stuff I've seen. This is stuff I know. This is not interesting in and of itself. But to
affirm, Jacob, something you said, I agree with you. The moment when he rises on the cop car, and there's the legion of thugs around him, that's a really cool bit, and it's very Joker. And I'm not even suggesting that in a world where they're anticipating a possible franchise out of this character, which clearly they are now, I'm not saying Batman can't or shouldn't exist in the broader world. I'm saying I just didn't need him here. Let Joaquin do the heavy lifting as he does. And I'll say this last part, and y'all can jump on it if you want, and then we'll move forward. But I think it undercuts the strength of the Joaquin performance and the Fleck character when it dials so directly into the Batman stuff. I think it undercuts what's happening there.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So running a little bit of ground of time, so I want to be sensitive to that because there's a lot to talk about that's a little bit more robust in the heavier thematic elements. So before we pivot into some of that stuff, is there anything that anybody else wanted badly to add that they did not yet get the chance to, by way of the script, the tone, the direction? I'm going to go around to everybody, but this is your opportunity to sort of give general cursory comments if you have them. Jacob, do you have any specifically that you didn't get to mention?
I guess one thing I definitely don't want to miss saying is, and this is kind of connects to my, wanting to defend the film and the criticisms about how it was not ripping off, but it bears quite a bit of resemblance to King of Comedy and has also been compared to Taxi Driver, both these Scorsese films. But it's definitely intentional. And so some of the criticisms that I heard of it were just, hammering it for that. And I found it to be a very interesting exercise. I don't know, but I mean, it's really just intertextuality. I mean, it's not a plagiarism. It's using these other movies very intentionally to, piggyback off of their themes. And we're going to get more into what the themes are, but I think it was just art functioning as art, but I guess we don't see it as much in film, but you have so many novels that, use like the framework of a different novel or the tone of a different novel. And so on a visual level, this was trying to look like this kind of grimy early 80s that we kind of see or late 70s, early 80s that we see both in Taxi Driver and King of Comedy. And so it's drawing that visual connection, and what those movies are about feeds into this movie, and you are kind of able to say more by knowing what is in those movies.
Right.
I listened to one podcast that kind of had like an angry nerd just shouting over and over, this movie has nothing to say. It doesn't say anything.
Why did you listen to that?
Well, it's a podcast that I like, but they kind of bring in additional guests sometimes, and this guy just was he was very indignant and kept repeating over and over that the movie had nothing to say, and he was so irritated that it mimicked the style and a lot of plot elements. It borrows a lot of specific things from King of Comedy and more of an overall feel from Taxi Driver, but I think it enhances what the movie is trying to do.
Yeah.
And some people are like, oh, it's stupid for connecting a comic book movie to these kinds of movies, but who's to say that that's not fair game? I mean,
I think that's dumb. I don't often make statements this blunt, but I think that the idea of, well, you can't connect a comic book story with these other kinds of what they would consider to be more high art or more serious filmmaking, I think that's dumb. I think that storytelling possibilities are endless. I think Christopher Nolan, who's sits atop the heap of what people think in terms of Batman filmmaking and not to take away from Burton, but he set out in the very beginning, said when he was approaching Batman Begins that he wanted to make Blade Runner and make a sort of a neo-crime film. So I just think it's dumb when people are so dismissive or reductive to genre possibilities. Now, we can argue.
And I might have the guy that was making this critique. He's definitely like a comic book guy, so he probably wants comic book movies to aspire to that. So I might have misrepresented him. Though there definitely are
fair.
people that are like, comic book movie, it's just a comic book movie. Why are they trying to get too big for their britches kind of
Martin
thing?
Scorsese among them.
Yeah. So definitely those people exist. I was kind of baffled by what this guy was saying, because he just kept saying this movie has nothing to say, but he didn't really provide any strong evidence, and he was just so indignant that they copied, quote unquote, these Scorsese films. And I guess intertextuality is not a concept that he has, but like intertextuality is almost inherent to comic books themselves, and now comic book movies where you have multiple iterations of characters. You can't help but have multiple Jokers in conversation with them, previous representations and what different Batman movies have done. And so it's fair enough to reference movies outside of this genre, and I think you're kind of opening up what cinema can do, honestly, because how many movies like really use like the visual aesthetic or some kind of plot structure to kind of do something new? Because having watched those other Scorsese movies, and I actually watched King of Comedy in preparation for like rewatching Joker, and I can see the very specific things that it supposedly copies, but it's a different story. It's building on things from those movies. But I'm probably going on too long about that. But
no.
For anybody who's like, oh, this stupid comic book movie thinks it can elevate itself by copying Taxi Driver and King of Comedy, well, I think that person doesn't quite understand how art can function. It's not plagiarism here. Definitely everybody was well aware of what they were doing, like down to the fact that you have Robert De Niro in that role.
Right. Almost too aware, possibly.
I'm not sure what they were. I think they were kind of like making it so obvious, like, hey, we know what we're doing. We have their blessing kind of thing. But the movies are in conversation with each other. And it's not laziness.
Right. I like that take. I have some thoughts on it, but first, Nathan, did you have anything else that was, just in general about the aesthetic, the tone, the script? Anything else that you wanted to make sure got included?
I love the scene on the train.
That's an excellent scene. Which one? The one with all the where he's?
Oh no! I'm referring to the horror scene when he kills those guys.
Yes.
I just think it's gripping and harrowing. This is macabre, but it's a doggone macabre film. When that gun falls out of his pocket, I laughed hysterically.
Oh my gosh,
that is so amazing bit of just cinematic comedy in an otherwise drenched with kind of cynical nihilism film. And I just love how he just pauses and stares, and the camera's got this up angle. It's hysterical.
Oh, yes.
It's terrible, but it's hysterical.
Yeah,
I totally agree.
I think that's one of two times in the movie that I actually laughed, and that was one kind of criticism in the back of my mind. I'm like, well, he isn't funny. Isn't the Joker supposed to be funny? And then I'm thinking back to Joker in like Batman the Animated Series. I'm like, nah, his jokes were really bad. But, so maybe that's just like the core of the character is he's not funny. But that was one of two places I laughed at dropping the gun.
So the one thing that I wanted to mention that I thought was fascinating, purely coincidentally, when I watched this the second time through, I just happened to Redbox it, and there was a lone special feature on the Redbox DVD that I got, and it just said, "Please welcome Joker." So this was fascinating. Have any of you seen any special features on this film at all?
No.
Okay.
No.
So this was immensely interesting to me. It's a brief interview. We're talking the entire clip, "Please Welcome Joker," is like 2.5, 3 minutes. And it is Todd Phillips talking about the, just absolute wonder that is Joaquin Phoenix. And as Todd Phillips is talking about how many different things Joaquin Phoenix brought to this role, as he's doing that, it is playing the Murray introduction, "Please Welcome Joker," and Joaquin Phoenix's entrances, and under it would say, "Take one." And in take one, he pokes his head out and does this weird little mime thing with the hand, and then it says, "Take two." And in take two, he's standing on the edge of the corner. So there were these multiple takes of him doing dramatically different things, and not just doing "Oh, I'm gonna say the line differently" or whatever. One time he walked up and dipped the lady who was guesting on the show with him. One time he went up and just shook her hand. One time he went up and did this weird flower thing on top of her head. He did so many dramatically different things. And Todd Phillips says in this little interview, he says, "We could probably have made a dozen completely different movies out of all of the different takes that Joaquin Phoenix did." He literally would do a dramatically different thing every single time, and that fascinated me to the degree of saying I would be in some later, in a fantasy world where there's a later Criterion edition or something like this, for somebody to go back, if Todd Phillips felt like doing it. He won't probably, but if he felt like literally going square one on this and making this film again, but with all of these different alternate takes, good Lord, that would be fascinating. I would think that was just incredible to be able to see that. So highly encourage checking out that brief 2-minute scene if you have one of the versions of DVD or a digital version that has that bonus feature. So with the time that we have left, I do want to address how heavily we go into it. That I kind of leave up to you guys, but obviously the film is saying some. The person that you heard, Jacob, saying that the film has nothing to say, I would agree, or at least accept somebody saying that they were boggled by the conclusions that it drew, or that they were puzzled by what it was specifically trying to say. But I feel like it's very clear there's some issues revolving around mental illness, revolving around madness. Given Arthur's illness in the film, manifested specifically by his nervous laughter, his violent fantasizing, his imagined realities. So I have 3 things that I kind of want us to consider. I'm going to mention all 3 of them, and then we can pivot into the conversation however we feel is right or good from your perspective. So the first thing I want to mention is I'm wondering, do you feel that we are meant to be on Arthur's side in the film? Do you feel like the film endorses Arthur's behavior, particularly at the end, or that it endorses his perspective? The second thing is the film making some version of statement about mental illness in general, or is it trying to, or is it simply sort of presenting a character who has mental illness? And my third consideration is considering our answer to the second one. Do we think the film, as was leveled against it multiple times by multiple people, do we think it is insensitive or perhaps potentially harmful in its approach and in its display of what it's telling us? So I'm going to share a couple of my thoughts to give you guys some time to digest what I've just said and formulate your responses to it. But one of the things that I thought about randomly, so odd, but I thought about a couple of different things when I was watching the movie this time around. One of the weirdest ones was I thought about Calvin and Hobbes, because there was an interview that Bill Watterson, the creator of Calvin and Hobbes, did. And I loved this quote. I'm going to read this quote verbatim. Again, this is from Bill Watterson, cartoonist of Calvin and Hobbes, and he says this. He says, "The so-called gimmick of my comic strip, the two versions of Hobbes, is sometimes misunderstood. I don't think of Hobbes as a doll that miraculously comes to life when Calvin's around. Neither do I think of Hobbes as the product of Calvin's imagination. The nature of Hobbes's reality doesn't really interest me, and each story goes out of the way to avoid resolving the issue. Calvin sees Hobbes one way, and everyone else sees Hobbes another way." So I found that really applicable to part of what I find interesting about Joker, in that I've heard arguments about, like, you know, what is delusion and what's not. I mean, the film spells out for you that his relationship with his neighbor is imagined by him, but it leaves so many other elements open to interpretation. And as I was trying to wrap my head around what was real and what wasn't, I thought of this Bill Watterson quote and thought about, no, that, like, in my interpretation of the film, Arthur Fleck sees these events one way, and other people may see them a completely different way. This is the reality of what is happening. And so to me, the film had quite a bit to say about subjective reality, almost more so than I would say it has something to say about mental illness. That's part of my take on it, but I want to give you guys, now I'm not going to call on anybody, just whoever has something they really want to say, speak up.
Well, what's...
Well, let me...
Hey!
So...
Well, let me prop up, Jake, let me prop up something real quick that'll feed into maybe where you're going, because it's me stating something to ask a question. It's not me following a rabbit trail here. But, you know, one of the struggles I had going into the film was, like J.K. Rowling, after Harry Potter is finished, she doesn't stop talking and keeps sticking her foot in her mouth. So Todd Phillips, before Joker releases, he just starts saying stuff that I'm like, oh my God, man, you're just painting a really weird picture. And like, I really loathed the, I made Joker because people don't like comedy anymore. You can't make comedy, and which is just really narrow-minded. But anyway, I found this quote, and this is going to springboard into asking a question, not me commenting on it, because I'm curious for the two of you who I think at the moment have a lot more invested in some thematic ideas than I'm at yet. But because I don't know if I agree with this quote, he said, "If I have to drill down on one overarching theme, it's the power of kindness." And a lot of people miss that.
Who said that?
This is where he kind of loses.
Todd,
this is Todd Phillips.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is where he kind of loses me. He says, "I think if you don't see that," it's like, the movie's about kindness. Let me be unkind in how I address this. "I think if you don't see that, you either don't have a soul or you're being reductive to make up for your own struggles in that area." But really, to me, that's where it started from. And there are other things in the movie, like lack of love, the lack of empathy, and childhood trauma, but the power of kindness really runs through this film. And I guess I'm curious from y'all, like, which hopefully is layering onto what you're asking, Reed. I'm actually not at all trying to steal what you're asking.
Sure.
Just,
no, of course.
I personally don't see this. I don't see this movie as a movie about kindness, at least in its sort of existent state, its current form. But I'm kind of curious, and maybe just adding that to the stew, Jacob, and you can pivot into what you were after.
I'm glad you
rudely interrupted you.
I'm glad you shared that quote with me, because that's 100% my takeaway, honestly.
Interesting.
I think if I sum this movie up, this movie is about the importance of compassion. Like, that's all it is to me.
Interesting.
I mean, it says a lot of complicated things about how the lack of this plays out, and I think it says things about just how society is structured, how we function as human beings. You know, it's trying to address all those complicated ingredients, but what it boils down to is the extreme importance of compassion, you know.
Well, and I think I don't disagree with what you're saying at all from a certain point of view. So says Obi-Wan Kenobi. Nathan never fails to throw in a dumb Star Wars reference. I guess why I struggle with that as a writ large label for what's going on here is the film still is called The Joker, or Joker rather, and still has to end with Joaquin embodying at least some version of what we know traditionally as Joker. And maybe this is kind of coalescing in my brain right now. Maybe, you know, it's like, oh, our collective corporate kind of societal neglect of the downtrodden is what will create the very monsters in our midst. Maybe. And that's on a certain level interesting. I guess I have a little hard time. I am defensive about what feels like, defensive is the wrong word. I feel like Todd Phillips is very defensive going into the film. Like, it was so kind of guns blazing, kind of, you know, you guys just don't get it. If you don't get that, you don't have a soul, which is just a really dumb sort of take to offer to the world. Not that the movie's about kindness and compassion, but as in, like, if you don't catch that. So I think the movie has a lot on its mind. I'm not sure, because of the foregone conclusion of the actual narrative, that it kind of knows how to best juggle those things, if that makes any sense. And this is I am not actually making a definitive statement. I'm just sort of wrestling in my own thoughts and spirit about my impression and interpretation of the film.
Yeah, and go ahead, Jacob.
Well, I'm not sure I'm 100% understanding, you know, kind of where. I guess I don't feel that whatever else is going on in the movie, you know, his journey towards that, you know, sadistic demagogue or whatever he ends up becoming, I don't think that compromises the underlying statement about kindness, because I think it is, you know, the lack of kindness created this monster. The lack of kindness perhaps creates every social ill. I think he is kind of stuffing in a lot there with, you know, how social services function, how income inequality functions. You know, how do the rich see themselves, and how do the poor people see the rich people? And there's just such a complicated interaction of variables in society and within the human mind itself. And there's really so many people that are completely ignorant of what mental illness is. So little empathy and compassion for people who struggle with that. And, you know, I think that's a battle we're currently fighting is like this kind of acceptance that a huge chunk of the population struggles on some level with mental illness and depression. And then also, I think there's a side of mental illness that is, you know, what we kind of understand to be evil, perhaps. And I think that's another thing that people struggle with in this movie. And maybe that's what Todd Phillips is kind of reacting to on some level is, you know, people see Joker as evil, and they maybe are wary of sympathizing with him, and they don't really know what to do with that, because they're like, you know, isn't Joker evil? He's doing these evil things. Well, yes, clearly, but the movie's kind of saying, well, your lack of kindness created that. And I think maybe some people react, even if they don't fully, you know, develop that thought as they're watching the movie. I think on some level that's a lot of the response to that.
Well, Reed, you may have something burning. Let me throw something in here real quick, because it pivots, and it's kind of my final word. I apologize for cutting you off there, but
no, you're fine.
As a super quick anecdote, Jacob, your podcast person, a fellow I follow posted an article around the time of the movie, and that was lambasting the film. And I went, and it was a more fundamentalist type of approach, and I went and read it, and it made some reference to something that doesn't happen in the film, but criticized it for it. And I was really confused. And literally in the bottom paragraph of this write-up, the author says, I didn't happen to see the film. And I was like, this is garbage. This is so absurd. Right. And I told my friend, I was like,
irresponsible.
Oh, highly. I said, you need to take this down, because you're endorsing, by posting this, an ill-informed hot take that's divorced from actual substance. And so that really riled me up and made me angry, as you can hear now. And I think my annoyance with Todd Phillips obscures what I think is valuable in the film. And it's interesting, this conversation about compassion, and getting to my kind of final note here. The second viewing really weighed me down in a way the first one didn't. The first one, I was just sort of energized, like, wow, this is really aesthetically gorgeous, and despite its grime, and you know, kind of really engaging, and man, I just didn't know this is what I was going to get, and I'm really on board. And the second one, I think the weight of his experience and just his whole life kind of made me heavy. And a phrase I wrote down that is reductive, and is a bit simplistic, but I'm going to pivot it somewhere else. Because this heavy layer of the birth of a villain idea, I couldn't get away from. We just need a hero. And I don't mean that in a comic booky way. And it's interesting, as you were talking, Jacob, that word hero got supplanted with compassion. And that really moved me in hearing you articulate it that way, from this standpoint of, like, you watch Arthur's experience, and I am left heavy and burdened, thinking, God, is this it? You know, like, I don't believe that kind of in myself, but as in, like, you know, it's so heavy. Reed, I texted you during that second viewing, like, this is is rough. Like, this is hard to watch.
I think
even though it's fascinating cinema.
I feel like that might be how I felt the first time viewing it.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, and just this feeling, wanting that heaviness to be lifted. And so in my reductive comic book history type of mindset, it's like, God, we need a hero. We need someone or something or some service or some institution or some agency that can offer aid and comfort and support. And it's too late for Arthur. You know what I mean? Like, that was a really potent and strong kind of sadness that I felt after it. Anyway, that's kind of the summary of what I've got to say here, Reed.
So, it doesn't have to be the final word of the show, but I'm going to kind of unpack sort of my synopsis on the film. I do find it interesting that Todd Phillips not only makes his case for kindness being sort of layered through the narrative, and am a bit emboldened by hearing, Jacob, that was part of your takeaway. Now, clarify for me, Jacob, was that Todd Phillips' statement was something that you heard before you watched it the second time, or was it something that you read after?
I had never heard that.
So Nathan telling it was the first time that you ever heard it, but that was still your takeaway from the film, right?
The only stuff that I had heard Todd Phillips say, and which made me, like, kind of hesitant to dig further into anything he said, was like the we can't make comedies anymore. Like,
right.
That the stuff that I heard sounded vaguely obnoxious to me, and so I was hesitant to even, like, look for an interview and just see what he said.
Right.
So I think I walked out of the theater kind of arguing with my friends. I saw it with 3 friends, and I felt like we all kind of took fairly different things away from it. But I know in that, 10 minutes after the movie, that word was already coming out of my mouth. This movie is about the importance of compassion. Like, that was
So what I find interesting about that is I see the film totally differently. What's interesting to me is I struggle with every viewing to parse out what is, again, it goes back to what I mentioned about the subjective reality. What happens in the real and what is a manifestation of Arthur's imagination influencing his experience. What I keep going back to, and what I really struggle, even 2 viewings in, is to find out which of these 2 scenes is real. Is the scene where his coworker comes and hands him a gun, is that scene real? Or is the scene real where that same coworker later asks Arthur, why did you tell them I gave you a gun? Which of those really happened? Is his coworker a devious, manipulative jerk, or did Arthur imagine his coworker giving him the gun as a sort of spite? And there are several other things throughout the film that kind of seem to conflict with one another. Arthur talks about, we visually see the scene where the muggers up front smash his sign. They smash his sign, he chases after him, or, they take his sign, he chases after them, they smash it and beat him to pieces. On a busy, crowded street. On a very busy, crowded street. Yet later, his boss tells him, you need to return the sign. And what struck me, even in the first viewing, is, well, why did nobody else see that? Like, they might not have seen the sign destructed, but why did nobody else see this sign getting stolen? Because it's a busy street. It's not at night. Like, there's cars moving everywhere. A car almost hits him. All this other sort of stuff. So it really planted this seed in my mind of how much of this is Arthur Fleck's subjective experience and how much of it really tangibly happened. And what that put me in mind of is, I'm not trying to be pretentious or ultra-literary here. This is literally what has come to my mind as I've tried to dissect this movie, is so much of the work of Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe was very interested in madness. Arguably, his most famous story is The Telltale Heart, which opens with the narrator saying, everybody thinks I'm mad, but let me tell you my story, and you decide if you think I'm mad or not. And he tells this story about this landlord that he had with this big vulture eye that drove him to kill the man. And we hear in Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart this story of like, I couldn't bear it anymore, and he's wrestling with his own, like, the man had never done or said anything to me, but I just couldn't take that anymore. It also makes me think of another Poe story, The Cask of Amontillado, which is all about two people who encounter each other, and one of them, in a bit of a drunken state, thinks that the other is being a friend to him. Meanwhile, the person he thinks is a friend is actively plotting his being entombed in a wall for some, transgression that the story never lays out for you. And you literally leave the story, the Edgar Allan Poe story, not knowing what or if the person who's just been buried alive did anything. And the reason why Joker connects so much to me for the situation of Edgar Allan Poe is, I might be reading too much into this, but do you guys recall from your viewing that in the first maybe 30, 45 minutes of the movie, at least twice, maybe a third time.
Check your notes, Jacob.
Reaching for the composition book right now.
At least twice, maybe a third time, the film actively shows us Arthur walking up the stairs to his apartment. And it's those same stairs, but it actively shows us him walking up. And I was sitting there watching it, and I was thinking, everything is an uphill struggle for this guy. Everything.
Sure.
And it's a very literal metaphor. It's a bit of an obvious metaphor, but everything is literally uphill. And what is arguably one of the most memorable moments of the film is him in full Joker regalia dancing down the stairs with ease.
So every other time he was going up the stairs.
It never shows him going down those stairs until it shows him dancing down them in his full Joker regalia.
Well, it does show him going downstairs when he leaves that job, but that's a moment of triumph as well.
Exactly. And so it's one of those things where I found interesting in the film is when he's going down, he's feeling better and he's winning. And when he's climbing up, he's struggling and he is oppressed, if you will. And it, again, connecting it back to what I was kind of scratching at with so much of the Edgar Allan Poe stuff is I think, and I'll share my thoughts about whether or not this is a valuable consideration or a worthwhile story or not, or what it means to us in the context of kindness and compassion, is there is a bit of liberation in mania. There's this kind of freedom in a sort of madness, and that should be, and I think in the context of Joker should be frightening to us, that the more we feel like we are kind of exploding out and just finally, like he says right before he smothers his mother, he says, I used to think my life was a tragedy, and now I see that it's a comedy. And it's one of those things that I just found so fascinating in terms of when people talk about, is this, making a profound statement about the importance of kindness? Is it making a profound statement about mental illness? What are we supposed to take away from it? And for me, I feel like it's important to consider what Todd Phillips brought to it, because author intent is really vital to proper criticism. But I also think at a certain point that once the artist has kind of put his hand, and Jacob, you know this, you're a visual artist, once you kind of put your hand to paper, as it were, there is something that once the art is complete, it kind of leaves you. And whatever you might have intended about it, there may be other things that maybe you didn't know you were bringing to it, or maybe you didn't realize were there. And I think more so than this exploration of the importance of kindness is this sort of examination of when we ourselves get sort of unbridled, and the ways in which, if we are just sort of turned loose, if you will, that what may feel like freedom might also be a version of self-destruction, or maybe a version of mass destruction, which I do find very interesting, but is a dramatically different takeaway than we must be kind to each other. So I'm kind of trying to walk a little bit of a line there, but that's more my current interpretation of Joker, is that it is a la Edgar Allan Poe, or in the style or tradition of Edgar Allan Poe. It is an examination of a man's downward spiral, and we can blame that on society. He certainly does on the Murray Franklin show, but I viewed it, particularly because of those steps, I viewed it more as like, okay, this is when he's moving down with ease, then he has won in his own mind. All while not realizing that he's literally spiraling downwards. So I found that immensely fascinating. That's kind of as much as I had to say on it, but I want to invite responses before we kind of wind towards a finish.
I was waiting to see if Jacob was going to pick up the baton. Did
I reach too far?
Know that those, huh?
Did I reach too far?
No. Well, I don't know that those things are in conflict with each other as ideas.
Yeah, that's what I don't think they're necessarily in conflict with each other.
I love that you didn't say anything and then you just like cut me off. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I'm shoring up your assessment.
Yeah. No, I like it. Thank you. I appreciate that. Your kindness has moved me to continue in a wholesome pattern. I think it is on the surface. Why because the question then is begged, Reed, by your take of why does he descend? He doesn't believe anything. It's not, he is not mentally well enough to exercise agency. And thus the slide down is enabled by what might be, as Phillips certainly states rather boldly, and that we've kind of discussed, a lack of compassion on a systemic level.
Right. Right.
But then that's, I don't know, I guess that then just kind of at risk of, I have this image of like an Acme dynamite barrel or something, at risk of tilting us towards heavier things we can't really dive into. But that begs that question of the value, right? Like, we are in a society, a social moment right now that actively resists, for good and ill, for good cause and spiteful cause, efforts to create an empathetic narrative for a character like Arthur Fleck. Not a mentally ill character. Well, yeah, maybe. But do you see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
because those two things in concert with each other, this idea of a slide towards destructive and self-destructive behavior, destructive on a mass scale, potentially, coupled with, well, it's just because no one was compassionate enough to him, is an incendiary and combustible sort of conversation to have. Like, random insertion here, about 6 months ago, a peer whom I love dearly and we have good conversation about stuff like this sent me a video, like a commercial, like a PSA, about you. Maybe y'all saw this. Like it was, the settings were kind of high school scenarios, like, oh, kids in a locker, kids in the
yes,
gym,
I think I
the
saw
cafeteria, and after this, like 2 minutes has passed, you realize that in the background of every sequence was this one kid who no one looked at, no one looked after, and that sort of thing, and the piece ends in this sort of mass shooting type of thing, and it's really, I'm sounding dismissive, it's really terrible. It's a really effective PSA. But I said to my brother, I was like, I just don't know. I don't. There's the call to solidarity and compassion, right? Like we have to partner alongside those most in need, and we have to, I think, develop, kind of civic organizations and government agencies that help assist those most desperately in need, like the Arthurs and this little boy in this video. At the same time, I wrestle with even knowing, even believing. Reed, you and I have talked about this so many times in conversation on the show. Like we share the burden of each other's well-being.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, it can sometimes feel like this. I don't know. I don't know exactly where I'm trying to land my moment here, other than just to say, I understand why the question gets asked of the value of an exercise like Joker at this particular moment. I'm not even saying I agree or disagree with it. I understand why that question gets asked. Anyway.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I struggle a lot with that, because one of the things that I am constantly challenging myself with, there are things that exist in the world and took off for culture and society that not only puzzle and baffle me, but that I would actively sort of rail against as like, hey, I don't like what this is doing to us. Like, I would cite certain trends in like media and entertainment or something like that, but they clearly sort of connected on a certain point and went wild with it, which I think is arguably exactly what Joker did as well. It connected with a wide group of people. And I think part of the thing that I always struggle with is, the scriptures say, this is of course in context of like, behaviors and stuff. It says, all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. And so I kind of apply that in this other broad stroke to moments like this, where it's like, well, you can tell any story you want to tell. That doesn't mean it's going to be helpful. You can, illustrate anything you want to illustrate, but that doesn't mean it's going to be beneficial. And I think part of the struggle that we have to say is, because, and this is something we are not quite comfortable doing, is, I think you've articulated this on the show before, Nathan, where you say like, it's got to be perfect or it's garbage, is kind of the binary in which people try
media and culture. Yeah.
Right. And what we so rarely talk about is how something can be perhaps helpful to a certain group and harmful to certain other people, or harmful to things at large. Like the ways in which art in general can articulate things for us or help us to experience emotionally things that would be cathartic might simultaneously trigger some people. And things that are done in an artistic way, particularly if it's done with the craftsmanship that causes it to really catch on, it's not cheaply done, it's skillfully done. It is entirely possible that two people could watch it, and based on their own experiences, one person might be painfully triggered by something, another person might be finally coming into terms on something that they didn't quite understand before. And so that's why I always struggle with categorizing a film like Joker as, is this good for us or is this not good for us?
Sure.
Is because I really think it depends on how you approach it, and I think it depends on what you bring to it. Is it possible that the way the film does things is somewhat harmful? Maybe. We talked, Nathan, you and I, about Stephen King's article Guns,
right,
wherein he referenced rage, and he himself said there's a lot of truth in rage, and it's difficult to quiet truth, but at the same time it clearly was an accelerant to certain other aspects that he didn't feel was responsible to let continue. And maybe that's a fair question to lob at Joker as well, but I think regardless of where you might land on that subject, I think it's important for us to recognize that the impact is as complex as the film is. And so you'll have the spectrum of people on the podcast saying it has nothing to say, and other people saying it's this rich, subtextual work that's worth mining to the
And then
depths.
you'll have people saying stuff's in it that isn't in it because they didn't actually see it.
and those people just need to leave the conversation. I think we can all at least agree on that.
Yes.
Okay, well, I feel a bit remiss. I'm ready to kind of exit the conversation, but Jacob hasn't chimed in a little bit, and so Jacob, is there anything that we've said in the last little bit, or anything that you want to say specifically before we head to the fog meter and sort of close off for the episode?
I don't think I have anything like revelatory to add. I think I made the main points I wanted to. I'm also a little sleepy, winding down.
Understood.
Jacob, I was hoping
It's past my bedtime.
I was hoping in response to Reed's prompt that you would have just said you wouldn't get it.
That would.
Well, we can fix it. We can fix it in post.
We can take it again. Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, let's get this clean.
We can edit. Go back to the edit. So let us, if I may, Reed, can I pivot us to the fog meter?
By all means.
For the very first full episode of 2020. And the very first installment of the best of 2019 in this February, the year 2020, starting with the likely Joaquin Phoenix Oscar-winning performance in Todd Phillips' Joker. We are going to pivot to the fog meter, where we are going to, on a scale of 0 to 10, gauge the fear, how well, if at all, it scared us, and the God, how much, if any, substance existed, meter. And I will start, just to give everyone a minute to think, and then we'll aggregate these into a formal score. So in the fear category, I think I am going to land... this movie is heavy, and it's in places quite traditionally horror scary and quite existentially horror scary. So I think I may actually land at about a 7 on the fear measure for Joker. Reed, what about you?
I'm kind of right there with you. The moment you started talking about the fear thing, I don't think we've mentioned it explicitly in this episode, but the moment where he does the dance in the bathroom after he's killed the people on the subway,
crazy and amazing,
awful.
That
as a 45 seconds to 1 minute scene of footage is mesmerizing and frightening and everything. And almost for that scene alone, although there are many other reasons, I'm going to land at an 8 on the fear factor.
Nice. Jacob, what about you?
Yeah, I'm going to do an 8 as well. You kind of grade a movie like this on a different scale, when considering horror, but,
right.
more like the existential horror that it presents, really. So yeah, I'll give it the 8.
Totally. Awesome. And Reed, I'm trusting you to be keeping up with these tallies so that you can give our
absolutely am.
Yep, absolutely. So now we're at the God meter, the substance meter. What does this movie have to say, and how would we quantify that? I don't love the way Todd Phillips sells his movie. I do really feel like there's a lot going on in this movie, some of which still remains somewhat elusive to me. But for what I believe is there and for what I can currently apprehend, I think I will probably land at an 8. So I'm going to land at an 8. I'm going to go to Jacob and then you, Reed. So Jacob, what about you in terms of the substance factor?
I think I got to give it a 10 because
nice.
I do feel really strongly about a lot of the themes that it's at least attempting to say something about.
And it just makes you want to dance.
Oh, yeah.
Reed, what about you in the God meter?
I really struggle with this measurement. My struggle in brief is I feel like there's a ton of things in the film, and I feel like Todd Phillips in interviews continually affirms that he has no idea what any of it is. And so that's why I struggle, because I do feel like there's a lot into it. I feel like Todd Phillips has kind of stumbled into something that was a bit beyond him. And I think a large part of that is because of Joaquin Phoenix. I think Joaquin Phoenix brings some mesmerizing, compelling, and tremendous things to the role. So I'm going to a bit split my feelings on it and land on a 7 for substance. So that means that we give Joker, Todd Phillips's Joker, an 8 out of 10 on the fog meter. We give it a pretty solid 8. Absolutely.
I mean, it might win Best Picture. I doubt it, actually.
Yeah, that would be alarming. Nathan, if I may, the question that's
sure
probably more complicated than it should be is, would you? I'm gonna start with you, Jacob. Would you recommend Joker to people?
It'd really have to depend on the person, perhaps, but I'd say in general, yeah.
All right. What about you, Nathan?
I can't agree more with our friend Jacob here. That it's all context, you know. I mean, is it a fascinating piece of cinema? Absolutely. Do you really need to be kind of in an okay spot to digest it? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we're all kind of on the same page that in general it kind of depends on the person, but in general, we'd recommend Joker. Awesome. So yes, with those recommendations in place, we put to bed episode 1 of our best of 2019 coverage here in February in this brand new Fear of God year. Jacob, thank you so much, man. It is such a pleasure to get to chat with you, get to have you on the show. I know our listeners appreciate the amazing work you have done to help bring to life the Fear of God branding. So thank you so much for being a part of the conversation today. Next week, we are discussing the foreign language juggernaut that is Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, an amazing film, incredibly worth your time with no reservation whatsoever. Seek it out if you haven't. If you have watched it, watch it again. There's a whole lot to get out of it. So that is it for this episode of The Fear of God. Reed, it's good to be with you again, brother. Jacob,
you as well, man.
Don't be a stranger.
Jacob, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Listeners, fear nothing else and be on your way rejoicing. Yes. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
See you later.
Adios.
Bye.
The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but not the end of the conversation. And you can continue the conversation in a variety of ways. Start by visiting thefearofgodpodcast.com for all the latest episodes and news, as well as for merchandise and how to contact us. You can follow us on Twitter at The Fear of God, on Instagram at Fear of God Podcast, or join the Facebook Fear of God discussion group. Special thanks to Jacob Hunt of jacobhuntcomics.com for our artwork, to Lee Wright and Reed Lackey for our theme music, and to Tyler Smith and morethanonelesson.com for making our show possible. Lastly, be sure to subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice, and if you listen to us through iTunes, we would greatly appreciate a rating and a review. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.